welcome back to another episode of Navigating Wellness. Now in today's episode, I'd like to touch on something which doesn't usually get enough attention or airtime in the wellness space, and that is the risk of extremism or seeking perfection whenever undertaking a certain type of health practice. Now this is something that I've fallen victim to on several occasions, from being hardcore on an intermittent fasting regimen to following a 100% pure fruitarian diet to going on a multiple day long juice fast to going on a mono fruit diet for several weeks at a time. And at the time I thought I was doing it for the sake of my health, for the sake of discipline, for the sake of purity, in the hope that these regimens will work. However, there was something much more deeper underlying the intention with which I was adopting these practices, because I allowed for no flexibility on a number of these regimens. And oftentimes it requires us to take that step back and really reflect on the reasons why we are adopting this practice of extremism or seeking perfection when undertaking a number of these health practices. For myself, when I went down this path and I started reflecting on it, I started to recognize that it wasn't with the intent of health, but it was actually stemming from an ego trip. Oftentimes, many of us fall within this trap when it comes to going on all these diets. Rather than making it a somewhat comfortable experience, somewhat happy experience, it tends to become more stressful because we start to seek perfection. And when we end up seeking that perfection and it no longer becomes about healing, it actually becomes more about this ego trip, about trying to seek validation, and all the beneficial effects of this diet or protocol that we are following starts to reduce. So yes, you may experience some of the benefits, but we don't end up getting the full benefits because it turns into such a stressful experience. So it's often really important, whenever you find yourself falling victim to the extremism, to the perfection, to take that step back and start to ask yourself the question, why am I being so extreme? Why am I allowing myself to follow this diet so strictly without allowing any flexibility? And it's also important to ask yourself, who are you really trying to impress? Is it some fragile part of you that needs a bit of shadow work, that needs a bit of self-reflection to recognize why in fact we need that validation? Because for me, on several instances, I recognized that I was doing it for not so much for external validation, but to seek that internal validation, to say that I'm capable of this, but who are you really trying to prove that to? And that is how sometimes when we find ourselves down this path of chasing extremism or perfection on a number of these protocols, it's a perfect opportunity to turn it into a shadow work exercise so that we can resolve this before continuing with the protocol. Because sometimes when we go through this exercise, we can afford ourselves more flexibility when it comes to adopting these health practices, so that we can approach it with much more joy, with much more reverence to the practice itself, and it ends up stemming from the right intention, from the intention of seeking healing rather than seeking validation for yourself. So in essence, the intention behind your healing practice or protocol matters way more than the protocol itself. And this is something that I started to realize as I went further down this path and started to become more aware of these behavior patterns. Now, this isn't me saying that it's an excuse to be frivolous when it comes to a number of our health practices that we are following, but it is an opportunity to reflect and to recognize what are our non-negotiables, what are those things that are not really stemming from an ego standpoint, but from a core value standpoint. And those will be generally things that are your non-negotiables. For example, if you're not consuming meat, or you taking upon a certain dietary practice like following a plant-based diet because it stems from those deeper ethical values, then that's not really stemming from an ego standpoint, and that becomes a non-negotiable. However, things like sticking to an intermittent fasting regimen may be something where you can allow yourself more flexibility, especially if you're traveling I remember when I was following this intermittent fasting regimen so strictly that I wasn't willing to allow myself that flexibility. And sometimes when you are traveling and you're visiting family, you may need to allow for that more flexibility so that you're not compromising on the joy of the moment and you're allowing yourself to partake in family breakfast events or whatever dinner it is, so you don't deny yourself the joy of the moment because you are trying to be so rigorous in following your intermittent fasting regimen. So these are the things where by being more flexible, you allow yourself to be more realistic when it comes to adopting a number of these health practices and make those exceptions or allow yourself the flexibility when the occasion calls for it. This doesn't mean that you're making exceptions all the time and becoming very careless about the health protocol that you're following. It's not about shifting to the other end of the spectrum. It's about finding that perfect balance where you're not moving to the extreme, where you're not ending up becoming a perfectionist when it comes to these health goals. And it's about doing that deeper reflection exercise, doing that conscious work where you really apply that critical thinking to understand where exactly this desire to be perfect or extreme, what the health protocol is really stemming from. Because when we end up in that situation, we often come to find out that it's more so from seeking an ego win or seeking validation rather than seeking healing. Because as I mentioned before, when it comes to chasing perfectionism, it's often because we're chasing validation for ourselves. And it's a trap that so many of us get caught up in whenever we're following this, because we watch a number of these YouTube influencers and people out there on social media that will tell you about how they followed a certain diet for X number of days so strictly, and we try and chase that same goal. It's almost like your ego gets caught up into it so that you can validate yourself to say, yeah, I've done that too. I've also been on this diet for X number of days. However, it's not about that. It's not about that. And be careful of these distractions in social media and from a number of these influencers, because they actually distract you from your path to seeking healing, which is the real goal and the reason why you undertook a certain health protocol or a certain practice. So as you go through this exercise of taking that step back and really reflecting on why you are becoming extreme, and really start to reflect on it and dive deeper. Don't look at the surface level answers that your ego is going to toss at you, because the ego is going to tell you things like, I'm doing it for my health, I'm doing it for the sake of healing from my condition. But when you dive deeper, you'll see that the shadow work really starts to come out, and that's when you realize it's much more of an ego trip and seeking that validation. So this was the part where I recognized that just doing it on a surface level is not good enough. You have to take that step back and dive deeper if you really want to get to the core reason why you are chasing this perfection or extremism in the case of the health protocol that you're following. And to recognize that by being in this state where you're chasing perfection, you're causing actually a lot of stress, mental stress, anxiety on yourself, because it often calls for extreme amounts of discipline, and it ends up becoming more stressful than getting you the benefits that you need to reap out of these health practices. So if you happen to be similar to me and you find yourself being torn in a number of these situations and not knowing what to do, whether you should be strict on your regimen or you should make an exception and allow yourself flexibility, and you just can't make that decision, then oftentimes what I found really helps in those moments is to just surrender. Surrender to the higher power, to the source, to God, to the divinity within, and just call in for that presence of God or whatever you believe in to guide you to make the right choice in the moment by just letting go. And oftentimes when we do that, then we can allow for the space for divinity to guide us to make the right choices. Because there's been a number of instances when I found myself in those predicaments where I'm just so torn and I just can't make a decision in that moment on whether to stick to it or whether I should just give up and cave in to making an exception. But that guidance will hopefully shine that light and allow for you to make that right choice in the moment. Now, as a reminder, before I close, chasing perfectionism on your health journey makes it way more stressful than it needs to be. It's not enjoyable, it's not sustainable, and it turns it into an ego trip instead of making it about healing. Now, discipline is really beautiful. Commitment can be powerful. However, extremism is actually fear in disguise. So, be kind to yourself, stay present, and remember, health isn't a contest, it's actually a journey. If any of this content resonated with you, please drop it down in the comment section below, share your story, and as always, thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you in another episode of Navigating Wellness.